Our next topic, World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, in which we'll look at the 1918 influenza epidemic. As always, however, keep in mind before you watch these lectures, do go into the course online textbook and read, in this case, chapter 21. And that will give you the reading portion of this. And then from there, go forward and watch the lecture. So we'll look at the origins and development of the Great War, as it was called. We already saw how the United States got involved, so we'll sort of backtrack here. We'll also examine the American contribution to the war, the 1918 influenza pandemic, and then finally, briefly, the settlement devised at the war's end. Now, let's keep it really basic. Who fought? Who fought in the Great War? And more importantly, why? At the start of the Great War, which dates from 1914 to 1918, at the start of the war in 1914, two sides opposed to one another. You had the Central Powers, also known as the Triple Alliance, but they have several names. And you have the Allied Powers, that's our side, also known as the Triple Entente. And so this map over here is showing you who is who. So the Central Powers, that's Germany and the other side in Central Europe here in the blue. The Central Powers included Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and originally Italy, but then things shift around. That's in 1914. After 1915, Italy switched sides, joined the Allies, and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, joined the Central Powers. The Allied side in the war, our side, was composed of Great Britain, France, and Russia. And of course, that changes over time too. By 1917, late, the United States enters the war. And in the fall of 1917, Russia goes communist and pulls out of World War I. So those are the two sides involved. Why did the war erupt? Well, let's start with Germany. Germany had only been a united country, a single country, since the year 1871. Very late, actually. Before that, it was a collection of different independent German kingdoms, principalities, just this whole mess of Germanic states, not one country. So starting in 1871, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, Germany unifies together as a country. Now, to keep this newly unified Germany as one country from being torn to pieces, which could easily have been done in the event of war, Bismarck formed a military alliance in 1879 with the Austro-Hungarian Empire to ensure the territorial integrity of Germany. Italy joined this alliance in 1882. So right there, we have formed one side in the war, the so-called Triple Alliance, called the Central Powers, because they're in Central Europe, right? Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, right down the middle of Europe, the Central Powers. The terms of their alliance is very simple. If any member became involved in war with two or more powers, the others would come to their aid. France, faced with this Triple Alliance and having long-term animosities with some of these countries, France, faced with the Triple Alliance, then formed an alliance with Russia in 1894, the so-called Franco-Russian Alliance of 1894. That makes sense. France, long-term enemy of Germany, so was Russia, and so it just makes sense that they would become allies and then have Germany surrounded, right? So their alliance stated simply that if either were attacked, the other would come to its aid. And so what that did was to present Germany with two fronts on which to fight in the event of war, which is, of course, the last thing you would ever want. The overall result of these two alliances was that Europe was split into two opposing camps: Germany, Austria, and Italy versus France and Russia. So right there, something is set up to happen. Now, what about the British in all of this? and said much about them. The British had a long history of remaining isolated from any European alliances, just as they're physically isolated from the continent of Europe as an island. The British also historically had very bad relations with France and Russia, and Germany was the main competitor of the British. But eventually, when Germany started to, after it unified, after it started to industrialize and build a large and very powerful navy, that threatened British interests as an island nation. They relied on their large navy to protect themselves. Suddenly, the British began to resolve their differences with France and Russia. So by 1907, essentially, Britain, France, and Russia were more or less working together, but without an overarching Britain alliance. So the situation by 1914 in Europe, which is when this war erupts, Europe is beset by a system of complex alliances, this alliance system, which on the surface seems to be the most obvious reason for a war. And it's this system that permitted a relatively minor incident to set the alliance system into operation and thereby create war. That's on the surface. But the roots of the war, of course, go much deeper than a mere alliance system. So just to simplify the issue for you, this alliance system in Europe at the time, this was just a symptom of a world, Europe, that was bound together tightly in an economic sense, but lacked any kind of system that permitted free and open dialogue to peacefully settle their disputes. So the result is each country had to see to its own interests. Each country had to see to its own security interests through one-to-one military alliances, secret military alliances, some not so secret. And so you just need something to set it all into motion, and boom, there you go. So the incident that's going to spark the alliance system and kick it in, this happens in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a province at the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Right here, right, showing you on the map precisely where that was. Now, this empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this empire was ruled by the von Habsburg family. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you should know, was made up of different ethnicities. It's not just one country and one ethnic group there. No. It's a conglomeration of different ethnicities. Among them were Austrians and Hungarians, who were first-class citizens in the empire. And then the empire was made up of various Slavic ethnicities, and all of them were second-class citizens in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These included some Serbians, Bosnians, Croats, Slovenes, and others. And these Slavs, they felt subordinated in the empire, which was led by the German-speaking Austrians and the Hungarians, both of whom were non-Slavic peoples. Many of the Slavs rightly believed that they would never achieve equal status in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and therefore a lot of these Slavic ethnicities sought independent status. Now, if you look at the map here, you see an independent country of Serbia, but there were a lot of ethnic Serbs also in the empire. Now, they don't want to be part of the empire where they're not treated right, and they would love to be part of Serbia, being ethnically Serbian. So these are the kind of things that are going on. So various radical Slavic groups started to resort to violent means to attempt to achieve this end of being independent of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the result is, from 1908, there were various crises among the Slavic people in the empire over their subservient position in this empire. And it all comes to a head on June 28th, 1914, right here in Sarajevo. On June 28th, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Archduke, here in the outline, Franz Ferdinand von Habsburg, and here he is with his wife, he paid a state visit to Bosnia, to Sarajevo, the capital, on a goodwill visit to try to lessen these tensions that were present in the empire given this situation. Now, this happens to take place on a particular day that's very important to uh, ethnic Serbs in the empire, June 28th, because on June 28th, 1389, and this is the 525th anniversary of this, there was the so-called Battle of Kosovo. And to Serbians, the Battle of Kosovo, June 28th, 1389, this is a big moment for Serbians. In this battle, they went up against the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic civilization, and they lost badly at the Battle of Kosovo. But the way Serbians today then liked to interpret this is that even though they lost the battle, somehow they prevented Europe from turning into a Muslim state because they somehow stopped the Ottoman Empire from overrunning Europe. They're the heroes of saving Europe. Now, it's all nonsense, but they like to look at this as a very important date. So in their struggle for independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they pick this date that just happened to coincide with the state visit of the Archduke, where they're going to attempt to assassinate him. And they will. June 28th, 1914. So the Archduke arrives in Sarajevo. He's in a motorcade, as you can see in the picture here. And the motorcade was carrying the Archduke and his wife. They go through town, huge crowds come out to see them, and this group called Union or Death, and it's a terrorist group, a Serbian nationalistic terrorist group, and a nickname called the Black Hand. They station men at different points who would attempt to assassinate the Archduke, riding in a motorcade open car through Sarajevo. And several times as they're driving through the city, they tried to assassinate him. They threw a hand grenade at the car, it bounced off. Others couldn't quite get close enough because the crowd was too thick. They couldn't get in. And he gets through and watches a military parade, and then they're going to go back through town again on their way out. And what happens is they're driving through town. They decide they're going to take a different route. Nobody told the driver. He makes a wrong turn, and there was already one assassin who had given up at the time. And they make this wrong turn, and lo and behold, the car turns and pulls basically right up to this guy. He was a 19-year-old student and member of this group, the Black Hand, and he's right there. The Archduke in the car is right there. He's got a pistol, and his name is Gavrilo Princip. He steps right up to the car, pulls out his pistol, shoots the Archduke, and shoots the Archduke's wife. He shot the Archduke in the neck, mortally wounding him, and he shot the Archduke's wife in the stomach, mortally wounding her. The car then sped away and went to, I think, the local police station, if I remember correctly, where they died. Here's where that happened. It's right over here by this building. They make this wrong turn. He steps up, shoots them. I need new pictures. These ones are so bad. Here's the Archduke and his wife dead. And here's the car. You can visit it. Go to Vienna. It's in a museum. You can actually visit the car. And supposedly you could, you're supposed to be able to see bloodstains or something in there. But that is the car in which this happened. So this is a terrorist attack on someone who is going to be the leader of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because the emperor is very old. He's due to take his place, and he's just been assassinated. So the world was shocked by this, right? This is as shocking to them as, say, the Kennedy assassination was shocking to Americans in 1963. So the Austro-Hungarian government, they decided they're going to put an end to this Slavic agitation and Slavic separatism that had been plaguing the empire for years and resulted in an assassination. And they decide to crush the source of Slavic agitation. Now, this is through this group called the Black Hand. It's a terrorist group, and this is a typical human thing. We tend to decide and conclude that individual groups or individuals can't possibly succeed in big, grand things like an assassination of a world leader all on their own. That somehow dumb luck can't happen. That there must be bigger forces behind this. And that's what the Austro-Hungarian government believes. They believe it's Serbia, because Gavrilo Princip was a Serbian, ethnic Serb in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's got to be Serbia backing them, right? Because all these Serbs want to join Serbia. It's got to be Serbia. And they decide it's them. So they're gonna crush the source of this agitation, which they think is Serbia, right? Now, was it? There's some links between the Black Hand and Serbia, which they know about, but they're not the source of this. Same thing with 9/11, right? When 9/11 happened in 2001, some people believed, how could it be a terrorist group that pulled this up? They must have backing of some country. So George W. Bush was supposedly convinced of this, right? So this is a very common thing. So the Austro-Hungarian government, before dealing with Serbia, because they have this alliance, Central Alliance, first they had to check with their ally, Germany, to see how far they might go in this effort. So they go and check with Germany. Germany encourages the Austrians to be firm in this. And Germany offered to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's a diplomatic term, an old diplomatic term in the old diplomatic language of French. They offered the Austro-Hungarians carte blanche support. Now that's French. That means, translates roughly as blank check. That's the support Germany's giving them, as if they signed a check and didn't fill it in, the amount, and just handed it to them. Do what you want. Put the amount in you want. We've got your back. Do whatever you want, is what that means. So with carte blanche, with blank check support from Germany, Austria then delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. Austrian officials would be allowed to search and go through Serbian government files to find those responsible for the assassination of the Archduke. Now, is Serbia going to agree to this? No, of course not. So here's where the alliance system then kicks in. So here's the map. The Serbs, under pressure from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like, let us search your files or else. The Serbs counted on the Russians, fellow Slavs, much more powerful Slavic country. The Serbs counted on the Russians to support them in the event of war with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, Russia, you should know, had always had this dream of taking all these ethnically Slavic countries and having them in the orbit of Russia, as sort of their protectorate. So yeah, Russia's got the back of Serbia. The Russians, in turn, are counting on the support of their ally, France, should any conflict emerge here. The Germans have to back their ally in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy is a member of that Central Alliance. The French have to back their ally, Russia, because should fighting break out with Germany, right, they fear fighting Germany alone. They can make sure that's going to happen. So what happens? The Serbians formally reject the Austrian ultimatum as an infringement upon their sovereignty, and so the Austrians declare war on Serbia. This is August 1914. Russia then prepared and mobilized its forces to defend Serbia from an Austrian attack, and expecting the Germans to side with the Austrians because of the alliance, Russia went ahead and mobilized its forces to attack Germany and Austria. And you can see they all have a common border. Germany then just went ahead and declared war on Russia on August 1st, 1914. Germany also declared war on France, believing in any event, because of the alliance, it was going to join Russia. And so Germany now, everything's like dominoes, everything's falling. Germany next had choices to make. Who is the greater threat? Russia or France? Now, I usually ask this in class, and typically the answer I get in class is, oh, Russia's the greater threat. And we think that because of more recent history in the Cold War. This is before Russia becomes a world power, a superpower, I should say. The greater threat is France. France is the greater threat. Historically, Russia has always been industrially backwards. Russia couldn't mobilize quickly or efficiently. Russia didn't have significant military resources. Russia didn't even have enough rifles for all of its men. They gave rifles to the men who'd be up front and told the guys in the back who had nothing, well, just wait for one of them to die and then pick up their gun. The way to understand this, understand how industrialization unfolded in Europe. Industrialization in the early to mid 18th, 19th century began in England here, and then it spread eastward across Europe. So the last European country to be affected by industrialization is Russia. So they'll always be backwards. So France is the greater threat, is the point. So the Germans activated one of their military contingency plans, right? Armies come up with plans for all events. The Germans had one, to attack France in the event of war. This was known as the Schlieffen Plan, created by Baron von Schlieffen, General von Schlieffen in Germany. Here is the Schlieffen Plan, the German plan to attack France. It's a military map. A little hard to see. Here's Germany. Germany has a common border with France right here. Luxembourg is here. Belgium is here. And they would swing through Belgium around the heavily defended border between France and Germany, encircle Paris quickly, capture it, end the war within a month. Here's a better map showing you this big wheeling motion to come around and capture Paris. Right, go through Belgium, because this is heavily, heavily defended here, so it's sort of pointless to go through there. That is the Schlieffen Plan. The Germans execute this. They launch this. It's based on very firm timetables of that they have to meet and be at certain points very quickly in order for it to succeed. But the Germans run into trouble. Somehow, nobody expects this. Somehow the Russians managed to attack Germany in the east. So that forced the Germans to pull out some of their forces involved in the Schlieffen Plan to protect the Eastern Front. So this is weaker than it should be, the Schlieffen Plan. So when the Germans attack Belgium, not only are they weakened and don't have the forces they normally would have, they end up running into stiff resistance from the Belgians. They never expected the Belgians to mount any kind of defense. And the Belgians decide they are going to fight tooth and nail to defend their country. And that also slows the Germans down in this advance. So they're already weakened, then they're slowed down considerably by the Belgians. Upon violating the neutrality of Belgium, this brought the British into the war. The British, historically independent from Europe, they had a treaty with Belgium that should Belgium be invaded, the British would come to their aid. Why? Well, look, here's Belgium, has great port cities here, and here's France. It's really close to England, and should Belgium fall, England is vulnerable, Great Britain's vulnerable. So that brings the British in to the war. Germany had naively been hoping the British would stay out. Ultimately, the German plan to conquer France quickly failed. The German army was stopped just outside of Paris and then pushed back into northeastern France. And it's there that the war changed quickly from one of advancing armies into trench warfare. Each side dug in northeastern France and slugged it out with all kinds of new industrialized weapons, which we'll get to in a minute. So what I want to do, we don't want to spend a lot of time looking at individual battles. That would take too much time. Let me go over very, very briefly the major battles in the Great War, just to get a sense of the carnage and death toll, which is insane in this massively industrialized war. So the early battles. First, the Battle of the Marne River. The Battle of the Marne River. This is where the French halted the German advance on Paris in September 1914. It lasted from September 5th to September 12th, 1914, and resulted in about 513,000 casualties, killed and wounded. 513,000 just in this battle from September 5th to 12th. Then came the Battle of Verdun in 1916. This is where the Germans attempted to break the deadlock of trench warfare. It lasts for 6 months. The French hold at Verdun, and both sides lose in total about 600,000 men. At the same time, the Allies attacked in a similar effort at the Somme, the Battle of the Somme River in 1916. The British lost just on the first day 60,000 men. And in total, after 4 months of fighting, over 1 million men were lost, killed and wounded, and very little land was gained. In 1915, the Germans and Austrians attempted to knock Russia out of the war with one massive attack. The effort cost the Russians alone 2 million men in 1915. The British and French also attacked the Ottoman Empire. Where's that map? The Ottoman Empire down here in 1915, and the British poured 450,000 men down here into a narrow peninsula there called Gallipoli. Of these, 145,000 were killed or wounded out of 450,000. And the British gave up. They failed. Winston Churchill was in charge of this at the time, a young Winston Churchill, and just devastated by this. After Italy switched sides and joined the Allies in 1915, it engaged the Austrians, because they have a border, and the Germans at the Battle of Caporetto in 1917. And at the Battle of Caporetto, the Italians lost nearly half of their army. And only with British and French support were they able to stop the Central Powers from advancing into Italy. They lose half their army, right? Now, the question is, this is a flavor for you of how bad this is. Why was there such a high degree of carnage in these battles? The industrialization, really, of the Western world, that's what explains this. Industrialization. Massive industrialization led to the development of new technologies for war that were used on a huge scale. So this gist of it is, human beings came up with faster, more lethal, more concentrated ways to kill larger numbers of people than ever before. Among the most obvious were new and improved rifles. I just think back to the Civil War, which was just several decades before this, where they have to load Civil War rifles, right, one bullet at a time down the muzzle and then shoot. Maybe they can get 3 shots off in a minute if they're really, really good. Now they have cartridges, they stick them in and shoot very quickly. And right, they're good. They have, you can aim them and they can hit their target. They also have high caliber machine guns, not quite 50 caliber machine guns yet, but very close. And so you can just mow down your enemy in this effort. They also have artillery with a long range and velocity. And these in combination made the use of horse cavalry obsolete and the use of trenches a must. These weapons, these artillery and machine guns and all this are such high powered that the only way you can deal with this is to dig in. I mean, they have vehicles, right? But these are like 1914 vehicles where you crank up the engine and they put along. So you can't help maneuver these high velocity, high powered weapons. You have to dig in. So trench warfare is a must. So here's some photos of trench warfare. You can usually tell who's who by their helmets. These are a little hard to see. They look like British. Germans are easy. They had the same helmets in World War I. In World War II, the Darth Vader helmet, right? There's a machine gun. Here's what happens to the area between the trenches. It's called no man's land, just obliterated. And here we have, it could be, it looked like British. The French would have a little ridge in the front of their helmet there. And here's today, what they look like today after over 100 years of growth and erosion, trees growing and all of that. Again, the Russians are even worse off because they don't even have enough men to, they don't even have enough rifles for all of their men. Now, we've already examined some of the other technologies, like submarines, right? Looking at how the United States got involved. So that's also a new technology in warfare, submarines. So there's that. The war also saw the first use of tanks. Now, they began as these teeny little tanks. And over time, they got bigger and turned into these big boxy looking things. Remember the Indiana Jones movie where there's that tank in there? That's a World War I tank with the giant tracks. That's a later World War I tank. They also invented, in terms of industrialized weapons, flamethrowers to broil your enemy in the trenches, and significantly the use of chemical weapons. Mustard gas and chlorine gas were the preferred choices, requiring every soldier to carry a gas mask. Now, this isn't actually from the war. This is from a movie about World War I, but gives you the idea of having gas masks. Even horses, because they're still using horses, had gas masks during World War I. Also, airplanes are new technology and used for the first time in warfare. Airplanes have only been in existence for 10 years anyway. At first, airplanes were used as reconnaissance aircraft because you can fly up and see what's going on down there. Later, they were used as bombers, crude bombers at first. They just throw hand grenades out, and then they could carry some bombs. These are very light aircraft, keep in mind. And then eventually air-to-air combat, dogfighting in time. But all of these technologies being used in warfare, gigantic pieces of artillery, huge pieces of artillery, machine guns, rifles, flamethrowers, gas, all of this. All of these new devices led to the unusually high number of combat deaths, just deaths. So here's a chart. Now the numbers vary. So here's just the dead per country. So casualties over here per country and dead per country. Let me read you some slightly different numbers because they always vary. They're always estimates. The way they come up with these, by the way, you should know, is they take census data from before the war, and then they compare it with census data after the war, because nobody's going anywhere because of the war. And so you see how many people were there before the war, how many people, like men, are then not there after the war, then do the mathematics, and that's difference, that's the casualties. So the British soldiers, the British lost about 1 million men dead. The French lost about 1.7 million dead. Germany lost about 2 million men dead. Austria-Hungary, about 1.5 million dead. Russia, we don't even know, probably 2 million. 1.7 million is the conservative estimate, as you can see here. The United States, we lost about 112,000 dead. Half of those were due to illness. And that's because we enter into the war very late. Literally, or nearly literally, almost an entire generation of Europeans, right? Older teenagers up to people in their 30s are wiped out. Nearly an entire generation wiped out of existence. That's how bad this is. This is just horrific numbers. So there's a flavor for you of the war and what's going on. Now we're interested, right, of course, in the American participation in the war. So while Americans prepared for war in 1917, as you know, we looked at that already, the British and French continued to hold the battle lines. But the war had dragged on for so long and had been so terrible that these soldiers, these European soldiers, were at their wits' ends and very weary. And literally, they're running out of men, right? The soldiers who get drafted are getting younger and younger and older and older. Have you ever read the book All Quiet on the Western Front, or even, I guess, for visual purposes, seen the old 1930s, I think it is, film version, black and white film? Don't watch the colored version; it's terrible. Uh, but the story, All Quiet on the Western Front, on the German side of things, it shows you young Germans, very enthusiastic at the beginning of the war, ready to go fight. They're cheering, and then it centers around one character and all his friends. And as the war goes forward, they keep getting knocked off until eventually there's just the one left. And then it's just him, and then these old men and very young boys as soldiers, and then finally he dies. Right, it's a very anti-war film, but literally that's what's happening. They're literally out of men, and so when the United States enters this thing, that's a shot in the arm of the Allied side. That's why they win. It was at first believed the American contribution would simply be in material aid and money assistance, monetary assistance, but it soon became clear that the Allies literally needed an infusion of fresh soldiers if they were to win. So the one side to get the infusion of fresh soldiers was going to win, right? And eventually, the United States raised a 4 million man force of soldiers, and of these, about 1 million saw combat. The British and French at first just wanted to incorporate American soldiers into their own armies, but the American commander, General John J. Pershing, was not going to have that, and he demanded American soldiers be kept together as their own army. So they were, and the American army was inserted into the battle lines along with the French army and the British army, who had been fighting for years, and the French fighting the brunt of all of this. The Americans arrived in Europe just in time to counter this massive German offensive. Remember, in the end of 1916, Germany running out of food and the war being stagnated, Germany decided to initiate unrestricted submarine warfare and a massive offensive to try to end the war before the United States could arrive. So the Americans arrived just in time to counter that offensive and to help the Allies ultimately to win. Now, probably slowing down that late 1917 into 1918, really into 1918 offensive was the 1918 influenza pandemic, which ravaged the German forces and was probably, we don't know for sure, probably one of the reasons the Germans were not able to pull off this last-ditch attack. At least General Ludendorff, the head general for the Germans, he cited influenza as slowing the Germans down because they had so many sick soldiers. So the 1918 influenza epidemic, which allowed precious time for the Americans to arrive. The 1918 influenza pandemic, this was known at the time and sometimes even today as the Spanish flu. This is a misnomer. The influenza epidemic did not originate in Spain. So the fact it's called the Spanish flu has nothing to do with it originating there at all. And in fact, the 1918 influenza pandemic began in Haskell County, Kansas, in the United States in early 1918. It was called the Spanish flu because newspapers in the United States and in Allied countries due to World War I were heavily censored. And they would not report any negative news that might harm the war effort. So they're not reporting on the flu, even though it's widespread. So Spain, which was not under censorship, Spanish newspapers were freely reporting about the flu pandemic. And so people just started, because that's where they were getting the news about it, they just started calling it the Spanish flu. It's not from Spain at all. It's from the United States. So it's in Haskell County, Kansas. This is where it starts. And in this rural area, they had a very, very bad outbreak of the flu. which was then transmitted to a huge army base in the east of Kansas. Now, because of military mobilization for World War I and the highly mobile nature of Army soldiers, the flu, which got picked up at this big Army base, then spread rapidly throughout the United States from soldier to soldier, base to base, because of the nature of soldiers being transferred all the time. So it just rips through the United States very quickly. Ultimately, this flu makes its way to Europe. First, it arrives in the port city in France, Brest, where that's where American troops always disembarked, left the United States, arrived in France. And right away, as soon as sick American soldiers arrived in Brest, France, that city was quickly crippled by the flu. It then spread quickly among Allied troops, British and French. I'll give you one example. In May 1918, the British First Army in Europe suffered over 36,000 cases of soldiers hospitalized with the flu and tens of thousands of less serious cases. This was highly contagious. The flu then spread quickly around the entire world and had a devastating impact. Now, this was no ordinary flu. This isn't the ordinary run-of-the-mill flu that's around every single year. This was a particularly virulent strain of flu and incredibly infectious. It had violent symptoms. People who contracted this flu had bad nosebleeds. Some coughed up blood. Some bled from their ears. Now, this is the internal parts of your lungs which get infected and ravaged, and you're coughing up this fluid. Some victims coughed so hard they ripped up their abdominal muscles. That's how bad this is. Others, or most people rather, had massive headaches from this flu, described as a hammering behind the eyes. Victims of this flu had intense body aches, where to them it felt like their bones were breaking. And the reason you have those body aches with the flu is your white blood cells are created in your bone marrow. So your bone marrow gears up to defend the body. And it was so hard, your body's working so hard, it literally felt like your bones were breaking. Some people's skin changed color. A lot of people's skin changed color, turned dark, almost black. Others had blue lips or blue fingertips because they're lacking oxygen because of all the fluid in their lungs. Some actually thought it was the plague because people were skin was turning black. That's what happens when the plague, but that wasn't the plague. This unusually virulent strain of flu, which spread like wildfire, did not discriminate at all. It killed old people. It killed young people who had weakened immune systems. And most frighteningly, it killed many young, otherwise very healthy people in their 20s and 30s. They died because their immune systems ramped up so hard and fought so vicious against the flu. That killed them. Right? Their lungs would become filled up with fluid, and heaps of dead white blood cells would be building up in their lungs until they died from lack of oxygen or from pneumonia. My great-grandfather died in the 1918 influenza epidemic. Actually, here he is, right here. My grandfather, he was 5 years old when his dad died. He was 30, his dad. Others were so weakened by how vicious this flu was that they quickly developed secondary infections. And then that killed them because they were in a weakened state. What was the government response to this? The United States government, led by President Woodrow Wilson, said nothing. Nothing. They did nothing, or next to nothing. There were no public statements about it from the president at all. The United States Surgeon General, that would be the top ranking medical official in the country, also did next to nothing or waited till it was too late. Right? The idea was for the war effort, not to spread negative stories, to get to keep everyone focused on the war. So they handled this terribly. This is an example of a pandemic where you do nothing and it just takes its course, or next to nothing, or definitely too late anyway, by government. Only in September 1918, Starts in the spring. Only in September 1918 did the Public Health Service make any comment, and it only said it had no authoritative information about the flu. In Philadelphia, famously, in September 1918, a war bond fundraising parade was scheduled. It was expected to raise millions of dollars, this parade, get people to buy war bonds, fund the war effort. But the city government in Philadelphia was politically corrupt. It was a corrupt political machine. And despite the fact that word about this highly infectious nature of this flu was there, the parade was not canceled. Officials refused to cancel the parade. So thousands of people would march in this Liberty Bond parade in Philadelphia. Hundreds of thousands, about 200,000 people would watch it. And in the days just before the parade, mind you, Philadelphia hospitals, like the day before, Philadelphia hospitals admitted 200 people suffering from influenza. And that originated from the local Navy Yard, right, spreading through military bases. But the parade goes forward. It was a 2-mile-long parade. It had bands and women's auxiliary units, soldiers from all branches of the military, Boy Scouts, jammed crowds of observers, hundreds of thousands of them watching this. And now this flu, it incubated between 24 and 72 hours. So if you got infected, you would notice within, a day and a half or so. And just like clockwork, within 72 hours of this Liberty Bond parade in September 1918 in Philadelphia, all 31 of Philadelphia's hospitals were bursting with flu victims. 12,000 people died within 6 weeks in Philadelphia, with 47,000 reported cases of influenza. Some people were hit with such strong cases of the flu. Today it's called ARDS, Advanced Respiratory Distress Syndrome, where your lungs are just overwhelmed by both the infection and your body's immune response. People died of this influenza within hours. There were stories I read where one of them was, there was a streetcar operator. He began coughing on the streetcar, and by the end of the run of the streetcar, he dropped dead. People died quickly, very quickly of this. It hit people really hard. The flu hit in waves. The first wave of this pandemic was in the spring of 1918. Then it subsided with the summer. Then it mutated, because this is what viruses do. They mutate really easily. Then a mutated version of the flu returned in the fall. That one was really bad. This is the one that killed even more people between October and December. This is the one that killed a lot of young people, including my great-grandfather. And the flu burned out by the spring of 1919. Keeping in mind, this is a time when they don't have treatments, flu shots. They don't have palliative treatments for the flu in those days. So they are not prepared for this. A third strain actually hit in the winter of 1920, but by this point, right, so many people had had the flu and survived the flu that there was some significant resistance to it, right? Herd resistance, I think, is what they call it. And so even though it came in a third wave, that third wave wasn't as bad as the last one and the first one. So in total, in the United States, some 675,000 people died of influenza. What they're projecting for coronavirus, 100,000, 200,000 perhaps? 670,000 Americans died. Globally, about 100 million people died. Now, these are estimates. We don't even know the exact number, but 100 million worldwide, because it tore through the world. Now, think about it. It tore through the entire world in 1918. Today, it's a problem because of jet aircraft, and we travel so quickly. This is spreading around the world on ships, steamships, crossing the ocean and taking days and days to get there. People wore masks, medical masks, out in public. Hospitals were overrun. Life insurance companies went bankrupt because of this influenza pandemic. Mortuaries ran out of coffins. Morgues ran out of space. Cemeteries ran out of space. Mass graves had to be dug. Bodies literally stacked up. They would have horse-drawn carts going around through communities, I think in Philadelphia, and people would bring out their dead and stack them like cordwood to be taken away because they're just sitting there in people's houses and they have to be taken away. Even President Woodrow Wilson contracted the flu. He lived, however, it was reportedly not quite the same afterwards. 43,000 US military personnel, 43,000 died of the flu. Just in September 1918, 10,000 Americans in total died. In 1919 in Philadelphia, in one day, they buried 528 people. Now, let's put this into context. This is a massive pandemic, right? This is the worst pandemic since the plague in medieval years in Europe, which wiped out, what, a third to a half of Europeans during the medieval period. But for some context for this, in 2002, the West Nile virus, which was reported heavily in the news, the West Nile virus killed 284 Americans and scared people viciously. In 2003, SARS killed 800 worldwide, and we had a somewhat of a panic, and it shut down economic systems. Compare this to 1918, I guess we got into the sense of, could this happen again? I guess ordinary common people just wouldn't think about it. But yeah, of course it can. It's happening now, right? So now we have the coronavirus, the closest thing to 1918 that we have seen, 100 years plus later. The difference is in 1918, there was a very slow response, no national response to this, right? Communities would issue quarantine, shut down schools, shut down theaters, clean the streets, wear masks. But today we have a national response to this, even though it's not that great. At least we have a national response. And so that arc of deaths expected to hit 100,000, maybe 200,000, it could be much worse or on the level of this had there been no response. So this is a big deal, the 1918 influenza epidemic. So this hits right towards the end of World War I. Again, this probably slowed down the German effort there, but ultimately, just to finish off World War I, when the German army realized that it could in no way win the war, because the Allied side had the fresh infusion of soldiers, the German army suggested to its government that they should surrender. Right, why go to total destruction? So at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1918, an armistice was declared, a ceasefire. Now, it'll take about a year to work out a peace treaty, and I want to summarize this, keep it very simple. So the Versailles Treaty, which ended World War I, would be signed in June 1919. And even before the armistice, Woodrow Wilson, as part of his foreign policy, which we looked at, Wilsonian internationalism, he had proposed a list of war aims called his 14 points, which he presented to Congress in January 1918. And it called for a benevolent peace, right? Adjusting the boundaries of the borders of Europe to better reflect the ethnic makeup, to avoid those problems. And so a lot of these empires will go away in Europe. It listed 5 general principles that govern international conduct, like freedom of the seas, no secret treaties, no building up of massive militaries, free trade, mediated disputes, right? And as part of the 14 points, Wilson called for the creation of a League of Nations, an international organization to solve countries' problems diplomatically, peacefully, so we can avoid another massive, devastating world war. So this becomes the basis of the peace treaty. Now, the United States never joins the League of Nations, which will doom it, right? And Woodrow Wilson himself, he will doom his plan to failure or our participation in it. So the fault for us not joining it is Woodrow Wilson's and Woodrow Wilson's alone. Now, Britain and France, they were hesitant to implement this plan because after 4 years of bloody fighting, they were not in the mood for peace without victory, if you recall, as Woodrow Wilson had called this. So the French demanded, for example, Germany pay for the war, demanded security against Germany. The British opposed freedom of the seas. Germany wanted a peace treaty based on the 14 points because they're surrendering and this is in their interests. Woodrow Wilson was in a powerful position to get what he wanted. So the end result, the Versailles Treaty, was a combination of the 14 points and these vindictive aspects that the British and French wanted. So things like the war guilt clause, Germany was forced to accept blame for the war. Now, were they to blame? Not really. They accept blame for it. And since Germany was to blame for World War I, they had to pay for the war. They were forced to pay reparations, billions and billions of dollars, pay for the cost of the war. It's punishing, right? And again, we don't join the League of Nations, and the United States Senate never ratified the Versailles Treaty itself, which Woodrow Wilson personally negotiates in France at the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris, because he politicized it. 1918, when they're negotiating this thing, was a congressional election year. And right away, Woodrow Wilson makes it a political issue. He says, vote for Democrats like him. And he's telling Americans that means you support the Versailles Treaty. Vote for Republicans, and that means you don't. So he needlessly politicized this. And what happens? Americans vote how they want to. And Americans usually get tired of one party after a while. So overwhelmingly, Americans vote for Republicans in those fall elections of 1918, and the House and Senate go Republican. Wilson makes things worse when he goes to negotiate this treaty in Paris. He refuses to bring any Republicans along. He keeps them out. That's bad. He politicizes this. And even though most Republicans would support it normally, they oppose him on political grounds because he did just that. So again, the Versailles Treaty is negotiated here at the Palace of Versailles, which is, if you've ever been there, it's gorgeous. The big four leaders met to negotiate this along with all the other allied countries, but this is basically France, Great Britain, Italy, and the United States leading the way. And again, I'm not going to go through the details of the treaty. Suffice it to say, it had all these aspects of the 14 points plus the vindictive stuff of the Allies. It is a combination of the two. And again, because he politicized it, Wilson, the Republican-led United States Senate, never ratifies a treaty. Presidents can sign all the treaties they want. They don't become official in this country until the Senate ratifies them. So they're dead set against voting for this because of this political issue. So Wilson, though, he tried to force the issue. Right? This is the progressive era. He has the power of the bully pulpit, and he's good at this, as we noted previously. So Wilson goes on a tour of the United States, an 8,000-mile train tour of the West, to drum up support, to get the American people behind this and force these senators to vote for the Versailles Treaty. So Wilson spoke 4 times a day from the back of this train. At one point, he used a microphone for the first time in political history in his speech. Before this, politicians just projected, so microphones are finally in use. Wilson, though, keep in mind he had the flu previously. He refused to take any kind of rest during this trip. This is an all-out effort by his to try to get his baby, the Versailles Treaty, passed. And this ended up being another mistake of his because he started suffering from terrible headaches. He had never been in great health throughout his lifetime. He always had low blood pressure, or was it high blood pressure? One of the two. He had vascular problems, we'll put it that way. And suffering from headaches, really debilitating headaches on this train trip, Wilson decided to return to Washington, D.C., where he then suffered a massive stroke, bleeding in the brain. He then suffered an unrelated prostate infection. He was in bad shape. Now, his speaking tour was going well. He even planned a speaking tour of the Northeast, which would have hit some of these home states of these Republican senators hard. But he wasn't able to do that because he suffered this stroke, which left him paralyzed on one side of his body and incapable of thinking clearly. because strokes will completely incapacitate you. So he may well have succeeded in getting the Versailles Treaty ratified had he been able to carry out this campaign of his, but he wasn't able to. So he's paralyzed on his left side, close to death, and his illness affected his ability to think clearly, and Wilson only became more obstinate about not accepting any kind of changes to the treaty, compromises, which Republicans were ready to compromise and pass the treaty. He would not accept them. He was bedridden. He was out of it most of the time, and this was all kept secret by his wife and his doctor. And they carried on the country's business. And his wife and doctor, they would put the pen in his hand and they would sign documents, right? When he's incapacitated. This is why we end up getting the constitutional amendment if a president's incapacitated. This is Wilson on the right here, that the others would then take over because of things like this. So as a result, the Versailles Treaty never passed the Senate. The United States, therefore, never became a member of the League of Nations, and therefore, as one of the most powerful countries in the world, doomed it to failure. And so the Versailles Treaty, World War I internationally, the Versailles Treaty is Wilson's greatest international accomplishment, the League of Nations. And yet we never join it, right? So it's his greatest triumph and his greatest defeat. And who's to blame for that? Him. Factoring in all these different issues, his obstinance, definitely his illness, and his bad political decisions on how to deal with the Versailles Treaty. So there you go. There is World War I for you. When we return, we will deal with the 1920s.